So good morning. My trade is sports and exercise medicine. I run the program out in Chicago, as our fearless leader just said. A far more interesting part of my job is that I do a lot of work with elite athletes, in particular endurance athletes. And what I do is called what I like to call performance engineering. What I'm talking about is applying mathematical principles to the way athletes train and the way they race or actually perform their sport. And in so doing, we can really very nicely direct how athletes will perform. And one of my main reasons for being is this lie that everyone believes now, which is that it's impossible to win without doping. We've seen a lot of cyclists on the news lately, lots of people in other sports. And what I want to tell you is that this doesn't need to be so. That in fact, most athletes succeed not because of their training, but in spite of their training. And that by properly directing training, you can get some really, really excellent results. And I'm going to discuss some of those with you today. So this is Joanna Zeiger. She is a world champion triathlete. She's one of the first sort of subjects in these experiments that I did to develop ways of helping athletes perform better. And so we'll refer back to her data very often during this presentation, although I've trained several other world champions using these same techniques. And so perhaps in a way that may not be so good for my job longevity, I'm going to explain to you exactly how I do this with athletes. So we have an overall strategy we want to try to develop. The first thing we want to do is we need to know how much the athlete is training. And we're going to do that by quantifying the load, just in terms of how much they do, how hard they do it. And then we also apply a weighting factor, because we know that very intense training has a more substantial effect than you might expect on athlete fitness. The next thing we need to do is quantify performance ability. This is a sports analytics conference. What we want to know about is how do they perform. And we need to track that very accurately in order to understand the relationship between how these athletes train and how they actually perform. The next thing we're going to do is figure out how we're going to engineer a desired performance ability. And we do that using something called impulse response modeling. The engineers in the room and the MIT people will be very familiar with this math. For the rest of us, you've heard it anytime you've put on a CD or an MP3 or something like that. When you hear music and you hear the reverb or the echo, that's impulse response modeling, all right? The impulse is the music, the echo is the response. In a like way, the training is the impulse, the echo is how the athlete performs in the end. And you can apply these mathematics in precisely the same way. Finally, using a slightly different bit of math, we can actually manage event performance. We can look at some physiological characteristics of the athlete and very relatively easily devise the optimum performance strategy for those particular athletes based upon physiology. So let's get right into it. Really, the granddaddy of sports analytics was a guy named A.V. Hill, who won his Nobel Prize, actually I think he won 2, in the early part of the 20th century. And he understood that there was this very interesting relationship between how much an athlete could do, or how hard they could do it, and how long they could do it for. And what this represents is this idea of threshold. Now, any of you who have ever done a little bit of running understand this phenomenon. You know that you can start running and be all right, and you'll go a little bit faster and you're still okay, and a little bit faster still and you're still all right. But you know you approach some point at which that much increase in intensity will result you in fatiguing far, far sooner. This is a basic concept of physiology and was first shown in A.V. Hill's analytics in the early part of the 20th century. And what he did was simply look at various sports, the various world records in those sports at different distances, and plotted a curve. And what he found was this very nice sort of exponential relationship that in all cases appears to level out as the event gets very long. This is that threshold. When athletes stay below that speed, they can carry on for a real long time. When they cross that threshold, their time to fatigue becomes highly, highly predictable. And in fact, a couple years later, these guys, Monod and Scherer, actually developed the mathematics of this. And what they were able to show is that if you make somebody do, for example, let's pretend this is a runner, and what you can see here is that these sort of dots that are up very high, you can look at that as a 400 or an 800, and then they come down to a mile, 2 miles, 5 miles, or whatever. But what you see is that this curve levels out. This is called the critical power or the critical velocity, the effort level at which, if the athlete stays below, they won't fatigue anytime real soon, and above which they'll fatigue very, very rapidly. The other interesting bit of this graph is you see these shaded boxes. The area of each of those boxes is precisely the same. Now, for the people who aren't that mathematically inclined, that has an important consequence. What it means is that when athletes exceed this effort level, they start to tap into that sort of box. You can consider it a battery. And the battery remains the same size. You can either tap it out very quickly by sprinting real hard, or tap it out very slowly by going just a little bit above this so-called threshold. But in either case, you only have the same amount of energy to expend. It takes a long time to recharge that battery. So it's imperative that athletes don't run it down too soon in competition. And we're going to come back to this a little bit later about why that's so important from a performance standpoint. But the other interesting part about this is that you can see on the right side of that graph, we've marked out these intensity domains of exercise, what's moderate, what's kind of heavy, what's called severe or high intensity. This is not just mathematical. What's interesting is when this work is done across nature, this relationship holds. It's been replicated in horses, in dogs, in salamanders, and in crabs. It's a universal property of life. And as a scientist, that's why I find this so exciting. Because what happens through this relationship is once you cross that threshold to that severe domain, interesting things happen inside the body. On the left, you can see blood lactate levels. If you stay below that severe domain, below that threshold, what we find is that lactate levels rise and rise and rise until they hit some upper limiting value and the athlete fatigues. In a like way, if you look at oxygen use, the same thing happens. Even though they may be exerting a constant level of effort, it requires more and more and more oxygen until they punk out. So again, this isn't just simply some mathematical abstraction. It actually has a real-world physical basis. So what we're going to do is use that curve to decide what's hard and what's easy, okay? And so what we're going to try to do is make a dose of exercise, if you like. We're going to measure how much each session impacts the athlete's body. So what we do is we may measure minutes trained, and we may measure what fraction of that absolute threshold the athlete tried to maintain. And then what we'll do is we will weight it based on that curve so that hard efforts get much more weight than relatively easy efforts. Does that make good sense? Because the rest of it all depends on that. So what we end up with is sort of a numerical score. In the same way you'd look at a dose of aspirin for a heart patient, you can look at a dose of exercise for an athlete. And what's interesting is that you can actually now calculate how much impact different things have on an athlete's body. So if you look at that light gray curve, that's just a measure of power, an athlete on a bicycle, how hard they're pushing on the pedals. The dark line is how it actually ends up feeling to the person based on this intensity weighting. And what you can see is that it's disproportionate. If they hang out down sort of at lower power numbers, around 1 multiple of critical power, you can see that there's a pretty good relationship between how it feels and what it's doing to them. But you can see when they spike their power, there's a large increase in the impact it has on their body. One of the reasons you're trying to make measured effort during competition so that you don't run out of gas too soon. So the next step is once we now make a graph of all these performances or all these training episodes the athlete has done, we want to measure performance. And the trick here is measuring something that's critical to how the athlete wants to perform in their game or in their race or whatever you like. So in endurance sports, time trials work great. How fast can you cover a set distance? But in team sports, measures of strength or power or speed, whatever you like, time in the 40, maximum bench press, whatever you think is important for the athlete you're dealing with, that's what you want to measure. And you want to keep it the same throughout the season so that your measuring stick stays the same, so that you can always understand how the athlete's performance ability is changing. And so here you can see, this is just a prototypical professional triathlete that I've worked with in the past, and you can see over a period of several months the way their ability to really go flat out for 20 minutes increase. They start out around 270 watts, they end up about 300 for a professional. That's a relatively large increase over a period of a couple of months. So our next step is, now that we know how hard we're training, and now we know how we're performing, we're going to set up a mathematical relationship. And we're just going to make it on some basic sort of assumptions that any of us who've done any sort of exercise understand. We're going to say how well an athlete performs is equal to how fit they are minus how tired they are. And the way to think about it is simply this. If I asked you to go out today and run a 10K as hard as you possibly could, you would get some measure of fitness from that. You would also get some measure of tiredness from that. If I made you do it again tomorrow, you would be slower. And the reason why is that you're tired. But you've also gained some fitness. It's just that this new level of fitness you have achieved has been masked, if you like, by how tired you are. So what we're going to say is that fitness and fatigue rise together, but differently, one faster than the other, but that both also fade with time. That's why you can eventually perform better. The fitness hangs around longer than the fatigue does, so that if I check you again in a few days, you'll perform better than you did in the past, owing to your new level of fitness. And finally, the idea is that these things are additive over time, that how fit you are today is equal to how fit you were yesterday, which you've lost a little bit of, plus whatever you're going to do today. That's your new level of fitness. And the same for fatigue. So this isn't a complicated model at all. For our MIT friends in the audience, that's what the equation looks like. Don't let it scare you. All we're saying is that how fit you are, that's the first term, has a term that makes it rise more quickly or more slowly and fade more quickly or more slowly, minus the same thing for fatigue. So that's what it looks like if you just want to talk about a single session of exercise. What you're seeing there is simply the blue curve is indicative of the athlete's fitness, and they've gained 100 arbitrary points of fitness for the day, if you like, but that they got twice as much fatigue, which leads to a reduced ability to perform. That's the green curve. So when we do multiple sessions for the MIT people, now we're doing calculus. We're adding this up every day. And again, don't get worried by that. We got 100 points of fitness in the blue line. We rested a couple of days. It fell to maybe 75. We trained again for another 100 points. Now we're at 175. So you can imagine these curves going back and forth as long as the athlete's been training and as much as they're going to do in the future. You can know at any given time what these various levels were. Now, the bit of fancy stuff that we do is, remember, way back when we recorded what the athlete's able to accomplish. We know how they can perform. So what we do is just feed these numbers to the computer and say, tweak this model for me so that the green line, the capacity to perform, adjust that model so that green line matches what I know the athlete was able to do. And now you end up with a model that specifically describes the athlete that you're talking about. And so you end up with something that looks like this, where we can now track over time how the athlete's fatigue levels are, how their fitness levels are, and just as importantly, how they're going to be able to perform on any given day during the season. Once you have a model like this, you can add future training and say, I want the athlete to be able to do X, Y, or Z at their final at the Olympics. And so we're able to now engineer that. We're able to know how they're going to do in the future. So there are our performances that we measured, and now you can see that when the computer does the optimization, we get a really, really good fit between what we think they can do and what they were actually able to accomplish. That has an R-square of about 0.95. So really very, very nice correlations and really, really nice ability to understand what the athlete's going to be able to do in the future. Now that's kind of sexy, but what's even more interesting than this is that we can develop what's called an effect curve. We can say to the computer, based on what we just figured out, tell me on any given day before an athlete wants to do a big event, how important is training, how much training should they do? And that's the equation. Again, not particularly interesting. All we're doing is multiplying together the terms from the previous model. But what you get is something like this. These are two world champion athletes I have trained. They are the best of the best of the best in the world. They are similar age, have very similar physiological parameters. That curve tells you how their training should build and then taper so they rest before it's time to race. Those two curves could not look more different. In the former case, that's Joanna Zeiger, who set a world record at the half Ironman distance in triathlon. You can see that her training needs to peak about 21 days before the race, and then we need to taper it down so that she sheds all her fatigue and is ready to have a peak performance. Over there is Kat Morrison, a 4-time duathlon world champion. She needs to rest 4 or 5 days before she races. And it's important for her to train almost up until the day she competes. Now, if you're dealing in a squad situation at the Olympic level, which is how lots of people train their athletes, you would be doing one or both of these people a disservice if you tried to make them do the same training sessions or on the same schedule. So this is really important for training teams. We want to treat teams as a whole, but teams are composed of individuals. And if we don't treat them as individuals, we're never going to get a peak performance out of our athletes. But what's even more interesting is that not only is the response different between different athletes, it's different for the same athlete in different sports. So again, I use a triathlon example here because it's easy to get lots of data from them. They're all using GPS things and whatever. But what you see there is that the person needs to build their training different for cycling and swimming and running, and taper their training differently for swimming, cycling, and running, and strength training and everything else that they do. So if you really want an athlete who has to have many skills, like a football player who needs to be both fast and strong, their weight training and their, say, sprint training needs to be different, and probably built up and dropped down over a different time course to ensure that they're going to have the peak performance on the day you want them to have it. So it's really important for athletes who need to master multiple sports, really important for athletes who must master multiple skills. So this is Joanna Zeiger's World Championship season. And what I've done is mark with arrows major things in the season. Now just note the green curve, which doesn't show up great on this, but you can see the different peaks. And every peak there where we have a race, so you can see here in the early part of the season, we've got an arrow where she sets a new personal best. Now note, this athlete is 38 years old, has already been to the Olympics, and is looking for her first world championship. She won almost every race there that season, setting a couple of personal records and then a personal best, a world record, and a world championship at the end of the season. So once you have this kind of data, it's extremely powerful. We set her up, I think she had one podium finish and the rest were wins over a period of several months, which is almost unheard of in the world of triathlon. But our final step is this. Our goal is not just to send someone to an event in peak physiological condition. Our goal is to be able to give them some advice during the event and say, how should you execute this to get the best possible performance? Because athletes require some pacing advice. And so remember this curve. And remember we talked about this battery, this square hashed area that's always the same, that you can discharge and recharge just like you do a battery. So we develop a new model, and we say this, that as they go up into that battery, that it begins to be drained, that the amount you're using is additive over time, but that once they try to get some recovery, the battery starts to recharge, and that the recharge obeys some exponential math. So for the math people in the room, that's what the model looks like. Again, if you don't like math, don't be scared by this. All we're saying is that the amount in the battery is equal to how much you started with minus how much you've used, which is slowly recharging. And so what we see is very interesting. This tells us the relationship between how fast they recharge and how far below this sort of critical threshold that they are. And what you can see is as you go up to the right there, as the athlete rests harder, as they do less, they recharge faster. You can see as you go to the left of the graph, as they work somewhere closer to that threshold, so that a smaller difference between threshold and what they're trying to do, they recharge much more slowly. But in either case, even at the best of cases, with the best of athletes, the recharge is relatively slow. This person takes roughly 300 seconds to get back 2/3 of whatever they lost. Now just imagine you're in a marathon and you're running and the Kenyans are at the front surging, and you keep tapping into this battery to try and hang with them. What's going to happen is you're going to end up walking, and you're not going to get that energy back for at least 5-6 minutes, at which time the race is over for you. And this is how good athletes strategize their particular events. You strike your opponents where they are weak. So if you have a very, very high threshold and you know you can recharge very quickly, you get out to the front and you run at some very hard pace and you just break everybody else. Likewise, if you know that you recharge very slowly and that you have a relatively large battery, just that you're not very good at recharging it, your job is to go to the front and slow the race down so that you can make it limited to a sprint at the end, which will favor your particular strengths. But you can think about this in terms of any sports you like. It can help you to decide when to rest the line in hockey. You can look at, particularly in football, you can look at wide receivers and things like that and decide, when it's time to rest them, how much, when they've used is too much. Now, the application I like to show here is, again, cyclists. Why? Because they instrument their bikes with power meters, and we can get second-by-second data. So that green curve there tells you all about how hard they were pushing at different parts of the race. The red line is equal to the charge in the battery and when they're going to get fatigued. And what you see here is something very interesting. Early on, at point 1 on that graph, they're able to slot themselves into the race. They're not working too hard, and they're maintaining a constant charge in the battery. Then they make an ill-advised break, trying to blow the race apart very early on. And what you see is the charge in that battery falls to almost 0 by point 2, at which time they run out of gas and start soft pedaling, and the rest of the field catches up with them. Now note, they get very little recovery, even though they're trying to soft pedal, they're trying to sit in the pack and not do anything silly. Then later, when there is an actual attack and they're actually forced to respond, you can see that they very quickly trend towards 0 again at point 4, and now they're out of the race. That rising red curve is them soft pedaling back to their hotel. Now, the important point is this. That's about 1,000 seconds between when they blew up and when they got home. They still have only got about half of their battery recharge, right? So that makes an important point, how important it is to preserve this at all costs. But what we can then do is compare different performances. In the first case, this is a professional triathlete, and what you can see is that this was a race where there was lots of surging. So the yellow curve is their power output, how hard they're pushing on the pedals. The purple curve that you see trending towards 0 is the charge in the battery. And what you see is slowly trends down to almost 0. This guy got off the bike and tried to run and did terribly. He was maybe 5 or 6 minutes behind his personal best. So for the race the next week, we said, now we're going to do things my way. We're not going to surge out of corners, we're going to take it easy, and we're going to try and hold a nice, steady effort. What you see on that graph is that the athlete barely uses any of their battery at all, and he ran for a personal best after that, okay? So this kind of thing was very useful. But where it really becomes useful is when we go back and we look at actual elite athlete performance. So back when I told you about Joanna Zeiger and winning her world championship, we had a really interesting talk before the race. We had her models. We knew how she was going to do in advance. She was one of the best swimmers in the sport. And she says to me, I think I can go off the front and kill these people. And I said, you probably can, but you're not going to do that. That's the leader coming out of the water. What you can see just in the back left corner of that screen is Joanna sitting in second or third position, not using too much effort, just sitting in and waiting. Then she says to me, before the race, my bike power is incredible. I'm up around 300 watts. I think I can cream these people. That you probably can. We're not going to do that. That's Joanna sitting in the pack, not doing too much work, waiting. And the reason why she was waiting was for this. That's the race leader on the left. That does not look like a person that's having a great day anymore. Why? Because she sat on the front of the race trying to blow everybody apart. On the on the far side of the screen, you see Joanna, looking very good, running upright, poised, good form, shoulders are high. She's obviously feeling good. So when I saw all her competitors looking like that, her husband and I standing on the sideline said, hey, Joe, go now. And so she opens it up. In just a few seconds, she opens up this lead on the field. By halfway, she's opened up a minute. At the end of this race, Joanna set a world record by more than 6 minutes at age 38. So she creamed the race. And it was by doing nothing more than plotting her season using these sort of analytics and then directing the performance based upon these pacing analytics. And again, we've applied these to all different kinds of sports. Football, hockey, and all sorts of things. Track and field. They work really, really, really well. People don't use them because they get appalled at the mathematics. I've spent the last couple of years developing a software package that actually does this all by itself. You just plug in how they're training, and it does it all automatically. So I think, sort of in closing, great performances are possible, and they don't require drugs, and they don't require magic potions, and they don't require silly training strategies. All it requires is understanding how the athlete's body actually responds to training, and being willing to do that effort in tracking them. So it's possible to accurately monitor training to understand how hard you're pushing the athlete. We can accurately model performance to an exquisite degree. We can optimize event execution and plan future performances to really get what we're looking at. But importantly, we get these world championship, world level results based solely on the athlete's innate physiology and nothing illegal and nothing outrageous. And so the other interesting bit of this is that you can do a couple of things. You can identify doping, because what happens is suddenly the athlete performs way in excess of what the model says they should be able to do. And if an athlete does that, you can ask them, where did this come from? But also, you can identify the onset of overtraining. When the person suddenly stops performing the way they're supposed to, you can ask that question, why? And figure it out before they get too far gone and end up having a terrible season. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, Phil. So we probably have time for one question, and then we'll be on to our next presenter. I'll come over there.
Would this model work on a micro level, say with a coach trying to manage minutes in a basketball game? And if so, what sort of baseline data specifically for a basketball player would you have to compile in order for your model to work?
Yeah, the first thing you need to do is sort of understand that curve for the athlete. So it could be as simple as making them run up and down the court for several different time lengths to make the curve. But after that, we use this with some frequency with soccer players because we can throw GPS on them. But really, it'd be relatively easy to use. All you need to do is watch how much they're running and how far they're running. And you can either have an electronic way of automating that or someone on the sideline saying, yeah, they ran baseline to baseline, they ran to half court or whatever, and plug it in. And it'll tell you how tired they're getting and when it's time to rest them. Football is a great example because the announcer is telling you how far each play was, and you have the clock telling you how long they were running for. So I've goofed around with this watching NFL games, and it seems to work pretty well.
All right, thanks, Phil. We really appreciate it. Give him a round of applause.